You're not a doctor, sweetheart. You're a nurse. Learn your place. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before everything changed. Seattle General in Houston hums with fluorescent lights and the sharp tang of antiseptic. The trauma ward pulses with its usual rhythm, ventilators wheeze their mechanical songs, monitors beep in staggered patterns, rubber gloves snap like gunshots during handoffs. Megan O'Brien moves through this controlled chaos with the kind of precision that makes seasoned nurses stop and watch. 6 months into her employment, she has earned a reputation for flawless charting, meticulous patient care, and an efficiency that her colleagues whisper about in the break room. None of them know why. None of them have asked. She sits at the nurse's station updating a chart on a construction worker admitted 3 hours earlier with a contaminated laceration across his left forearm. Her handwriting is perfect, not the rushed scrawl typical of 12-hour shifts, but the deliberate, measured script of someone trained to document under conditions far more chaotic than a trauma bay. The pen moves across the page with mechanical precision. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate steady. Pain control adequate. She notes the suture technique she used, 3-layer interrupted with 4.0 nylon, subcuticular closure to minimize scarring. The kind of technique most nurses learn from textbooks. The kind of technique she learned in a forward operating base in Helmand Province, under fire, holding the femoral artery of a bleeding Marine while mortar rounds shook the plywood walls. Her left thumb trembles slightly as she completes the chart entry. Just the thumb. Just for a moment. She presses her hand flat against the desk until it stops. The visiting surgeon from the 75th Ranger Regiment, a combat medic named Clayton, here for a 3-day rotation, pauses mid-conversation with Dr. Richardson at the pharmacy counter. He watches Megan's hands move. Watches the needle angle. Watches the knot-tying sequence. His eyes narrow. That specific 3-layer interrupted technique. The exact angle of insertion. The spacing between sutures. Not standard civilian procedure. That's Tier 1 surgical specialty training. That's forward operating base trauma modification. That's the kind of thing they teach at the Naval Special Warfare Surgical School to people who operate in places where the nearest hospital is 12 hours away by Black Hawk. Clayton's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. He doesn't approach her. Not yet. He just watches and files the observation away. Megan finishes the final knot, clips the suture, and applies antibiotic ointment with a gauze dressing. She steps back from the bedside. The construction worker is already dosing off, his arm elevated on a pillow, his vitals climbing steadily back toward normal. She documents the dressing change time, 2,103 hours, and moves back to the nurse's station to review the next admission. Dr. Caldwell sweeps past at 2,109 hours. His white coat is pristine. Designer tie visible beneath the coat, silk, probably Italian. His shoes are polished to a mirror shine despite the ER being a place where fluids splash and blood stains everything. He moves through the trauma ward like he owns it. Not because he's the chief of surgery, though he is, but because he carries himself with the particular confidence of someone who has never faced a consequence he couldn't talk his way out of. He's discussing something with the hospital administrator, both of them leaning against the counter by the EKG machine. Their conversation is low but not private. Caldwell never bothers with privacy. Quarterly revenue projections are up 12%, the administrator says. The billing optimization initiative is working exactly as planned. Caldwell nods, his voice smooth as oil. Procedure upcoding is generating significant margin. Keep the emphasis on the complex cases. Make sure the documentation supports Level 5 codes. We need those numbers elevated before the board meeting in October. Megan's jaw tightens. Just barely. Just enough that if someone was watching they would notice. Her fingers continue moving across the keyboard. No hesitation. No reaction. But she's heard every word. She's documented 3 cases in the past 2 weeks where the submitted billing codes don't align with the actual procedures performed. One routine appendectomy billed as an emergency repair. One standard hernia reduction coded as a complex abdominal wall reconstruction. One straightforward gallbladder removal documented with complication codes for infections that never occurred. The patterns are precise. The markup is consistent. The fraud is systematic. And Caldwell's voice indicates he built this system deliberately. Her hands remain perfectly steady as she types. Pain is information. Fear is intelligence. Megan learned long ago that emotions are data to be analyzed and filed away. She's learned to compartmentalize them the same way she learned to compartmentalize the sound of a blood-soaked combat zone into manageable pieces that don't destroy you when you're trying to save lives. At 2,114 hours, Caldwell notices her. Or rather, he decides to notice her. He drifts away from the administrator and moves toward the vending machine near the break room. Megan heads there at the same moment. She needs coffee for the night shift that's about to begin, and they meet at the machine like actors hitting their mark. Caldwell is already there, inserting bills and selecting something expensive-looking. He doesn't glance at her. Doesn't acknowledge her existence. But then two other physicians round the corner, Dr. Martinez and Dr. Patel, both residents, and Caldwell's demeanor shifts. He turns toward Megan like she's just become visible. O'Brien, isn't it? His tone is conversational. Casual. Laced with the kind of practiced condescension that implies the question is rhetorical. Yes, doctor. Megan's voice is measured. Respectful. She inserts her dollar bill into the machine. I've noticed your charting tends toward excessive detail, Caldwell says. He's speaking to the other physicians, but he's performing. Triple-checked protocols. Questioning standard procedures. Textbook rigidity. He smiles. Not a warm smile. A smile that shows teeth. The thing is, O'Brien, textbooks are written by people who've never run a real hospital. You understand. Martinez laughs. A short, sharp sound meant to indicate alliance with the hierarchy. Caldwell continues. You're not a doctor. You're a nurse. And while your efficiency is noted, your tendency toward, how do I put this diplomatically, excessive caution with documentation creates friction in our workflows. We're going to need you to learn your place in the operational hierarchy. Do you understand what I'm suggesting? Megan selects black coffee. The machine dispenses it with a metallic hiss. She retrieves the cup and turns to face Caldwell directly. Her eyes meet his for exactly 2 seconds. Not defiant. Not submissive. Just present. Just meeting his gaze like a human being meeting another human being. I understand, doctor. Caldwell's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. He expected something else. An apology. An explanation. Deference. Not this calm, flat acknowledgement. Good, he says, but there's an edge to it now. Because if you can't adapt to how we operate here, we can arrange for security to escort you out. We don't need cowboys in this facility. Understood? Yes, doctor. She doesn't flinch. Doesn't blush. Doesn't look away. Her hands holding the coffee cup are perfectly steady. The tremor in her left thumb has stopped. Caldwell turns back to Martinez and Patel, and they drift away together, their laughter following them down the corridor toward the administrative offices. Megan stands alone at the vending machine, holds the coffee cup to her lips, and drinks. The coffee is terrible. Too hot. Burnt tasting. But she doesn't react to that either. She's tasted worse. She's been in situations where complaining about coffee would have meant not eating for 3 days. Context makes most discomforts irrelevant. She glances toward the ER bay where Clayton is still observing, still thinking about that 3-layer interrupted suture technique. The night shift begins officially at 2,130 hours. Megan moves to the trauma bay to check her assigned beds. A diabetic patient with a foot wound requiring daily dressing changes. A car accident victim with stable fractures. A septic elderly woman with unclear infection origin. All of them need monitoring. All of them need documentation. All of them need the kind of care that requires attention to detail that Caldwell clearly considers obstacles rather than safeguards. She finishes her coffee at 2,146 hours. At 21:47, the ER doors burst open. The sound is different than the usual admissions. This is urgent. This is organized chaos. Two paramedics wheel a gurney through the doors with the kind of velocity that comes from military transport coordination. The patient on the gurney is unconscious. Blood covers his flight suit. His abdomen is visibly distended, not fat, but swollen with internal bleeding. His skin is the color of old paper. A Navy SEAL commander, the medic says rapidly, multiple gunshot wounds, shrapnel fragment near the cardiac region, blood pressure dropping. ETA to this facility was the only option. He was stabilized at Landstuhl but decompensated en route. The gurney moves past the nurse's station toward Trauma Bay 1. Megan doesn't move yet. She watches, observes, processes the information without emotion. Multiple GSWs, shrapnel near cardiac region. That phrase, cardiac region, means the wound is adjacent to structures that don't tolerate bleeding. The pericardium, the heart chambers, the great vessels. A patient like this doesn't have hours. He has minutes. Maybe. She sets down her coffee cup and begins moving toward the bay. The combat medic Clayton is already there, talking to Dr. Richardson, describing the patient's vital signs en route, the interventions attempted, the deterioration timeline. His voice is precise. Military trained. He's seen this before. He'll see it again. Megan steps into the trauma bay. The surgical team is beginning to assemble. Monitors are being connected. For lines are being prepared. Someone needs to manage documentation. Someone needs to anticipate what happens next. Someone needs to have the kind of steady hands that know exactly what a cardiac emergency looks like and how to respond to it. That someone is Megan. She moves to the patient's bedside and begins the rapid assessment. Blood pressure 67/43. Heart rate 138. Respiratory rate 24. O2 saturation 89% on supplemental oxygen. His pupils are reactive. His airway is patent. But that distended abdomen. That's where the bleeding is happening. That's where time is running out. And somewhere in the next few minutes, everything Megan has hidden for 6 months is going to become impossible to keep hidden. The grand rounds began at 0800 hours like a surgical incision, precise, deliberate, and designed to draw blood. Dr. Caldwell stood at the head of a semicircle of 20 residents, his voice carrying across the trauma bay with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like an audience holding its breath. "Let me show you what happens when someone confuses rigidity with excellence," he announced, gesturing toward Megan as she stood updating a patient chart on the whiteboard. Her marker moved with mechanical steadiness, not pausing, not acknowledging the stage being built around her. Nurse O'Brien here refused to sign off on perfectly standard post-operative documentation yesterday, Caldwell continued, his tone dripping with condescension like venom from a syringe. Took her 3 hours to complete what should take 30 minutes. Tell me, O'Brien, do you think your textbook rigidity helps patients, or does it just waste everyone's time? The residents shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Caldwell and the woman in scrubs. Megan's jaw clenched for exactly 1 second. That was all. Her face remained a mask of granite as she turned to face him, marker still in hand, and met his eyes with the flat, unreadable stare of someone who had seen worse things than a surgeon's contempt. The documentation was incomplete, Doctor, she said, her voice steady as a cardiac monitor in sinus rhythm. No apology. No explanation. No performance. She turned back to her chart and continued writing as if he had never spoken. The silence that followed lasted 2 full seconds before Caldwell's smile hardened into something uglier. Observe the martyr complex, people, he said, addressing the residents but watching Megan's back. This is what happens when nursing school convinces you that you're a physician. The residents laughed on cue, the sound echoing off the tile like applause for a performance everyone knew was cruel. Megan did not flinch. She did not turn around. Her hand continued its steady work across the board, each letter perfect, each notation exact, the physical embodiment of someone who had learned long ago that the best way to hurt someone who enjoyed hurting you was to refuse them the satisfaction of a reaction. 2 hours later, at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, Dr. Martinez and Dr. Chen cornered her with the confidence of men who had never faced real consequences. Martinez's voice dripped with mockery as he mimicked her tone. "The documentation was incomplete, doctor." He dragged out the words like they were something distasteful he had stepped in. Chen laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Uptight O'Brien thinks she's going to medical school or something. Someone should tell her she peaked at community college." Megan inserted a crumpled dollar bill into the machine with mechanical precision. The hum of the refrigerator unit filled the space between them as she punched the code for black coffee, strong, no sugar, the same order she had maintained for 6 months without variation. The cup dropped with a plastic clunk. She retrieved it without acknowledging either physician, her movements efficient and clean, then walked past them down the corridor while their laughter chased her like dogs snapping at her heels. She did not walk faster. She did not grip the coffee cup tighter. She simply moved forward, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum with the measured cadence of someone who had marched through worse than this. Her composure was a weapon they did not understand. Her silence was more cutting than any response she could have offered. That afternoon, Dr. Caldwell found her in the supply closet counting inventory, gauze pads stacked in precise rows of 10, each column identical to the last. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, letting his presence announce itself like a threat. "I've been patient with your attitude problem," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of power he believed was absolute. "But if you question one more billing code, one more procedure note, one more treatment decision, I will personally call security and have you escorted from this building. Are we clear?" Megan's hands continued counting without pause, her voice as flat as hospital linoleum when she responded, "Crystal clear, Dr. Caldwell." The words were perfectly deferential, perfectly submissive, perfectly designed to make him believe she understood the hierarchy he was establishing. He left satisfied, unaware that she had documented every word in the small leather notebook tucked inside her scrub pocket, the one with the water-stained cover from Kandahar, the one Naval Intelligence would subpoena in 6 months when they dismantled his entire fraud operation. Every threat. Every demand. Every moment he had tried to break her and failed. All of it, recorded in the careful handwriting of someone who had been trained by the United States Navy to document evidence under pressure. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 01 for 7 hours, when the alarm started screaming. The Navy SEAL commander arrived on a military transport gurney like something broken beyond repair, his chest torn open by shrapnel from a firefight in Helmand Province, blood pressure dropping in real time as 3 corpsmen shouted vitals that sounded like a countdown to death. Gunshot wounds to the chest, lower abdomen, left leg, the lead corpsman called out, his voice controlled but urgent. BP dropping. 94/62. Pulse 118. Respiration shallow. ETA 5 minutes. Megan was assigned to intake, and her movements shifted. The careful deference that had defined her all day fell away like a discarded surgical glove. She cut away his tactical vest with the kind of economical precision that came from experience, cataloging 5 separate GSWs in the span of 30 seconds, her hands moving like they had muscle memory older than her job title. GSW to the right chest wall. GSW to the left lower abdomen. GSW to the left thigh. 2 more she identified instantly and categorized by severity, her mind operating in the language of trauma assessment that had nothing to do with hospital policy or chain of command. The visiting combat medic from the 75th Ranger Regiment was hovering nearby, waiting for orders, when he watched Megan's hands perform a modified pressure dressing technique using tactical gauze and a pressure application sequence that made him go completely still. His eyes narrowed. He moved closer. She was doing a 5-layer compression wrap with interlocking angles, her fingers working with the kind of speed and precision that only came from practicing the same procedure hundreds of times under conditions that would make most people freeze. "Where did you learn that?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low so only she could hear. Megan did not look up from the patient's wound. Textbook, she said, her voice betraying nothing, though they both knew that textbook did not exist in any civilian nursing curriculum. It existed only in classified training manuals distributed to Tier 1 surgical specialists deployed to forward operating bases. She knew he knew. He knew that she knew he knew. Neither of them spoke about it. Dr. Caldwell arrived 20 minutes later, surveyed the patient with the detached air of a man reviewing inventory at a warehouse, and made a phone call that Megan overheard from her position monitoring the cardiac monitor. Non-critical seal, stable enough for transfer to Walter Reed in the morning, he said, his tone casual as someone discussing a grocery list. Not worth bringing in the cardiothoracic surgeon tonight. Tell them 0600 transport. And Caldwell out. He hung up. He did not see the patient's heart monitor beginning to show the subtle signs of pericardial effusion, the electrical alternans, the dropping voltage, the compression of the QRS complex that told a story Caldwell was not reading because he had already decided this patient was not worth his time. At 0200 hours exactly, while Caldwell was in his office and the night shift had thinned to skeleton crews, the patient went into acute cardiac tamponade. The pericardium, the double-walled sac surrounding the heart, began filling with blood from the shrapnel wound that had penetrated deeper than initial assessment suggested. The pressure built silently, invisibly, like a tightening fist around the heart itself. The commander's blood pressure collapsed. The monitor began screaming. 87/55. 80/48. 68/42. Each number a step closer to the moment his heart would simply stop because there was no room left for it to beat. Megan was at his bedside in 3 seconds. She saw the pattern before it fully developed. She saw the pressure tracing flattening, the pulses paradoxes manifesting, the blood pressure dropping more than 10 millimeters of mercury with each breath, the heart trapped under pressure, suffocating. She reached for her phone and paged the on-call surgeon with the calm precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. This is Nurse O'Brien in Trauma Bay 4. Commander patient going into acute cardiac tamponade. Pericardium filling with blood. Pressure critical. Need you at the bedside. Now. Dr. Patterson answered 7 seconds later with barely concealed irritation in his voice. It's 2 in the morning for just a seal? Stabilize him. I'll evaluate at 0700. The line went dead. The monitor continued its descent. 55/35. The commander's face had gone the color of old concrete. Megan stood motionless for exactly 1 second, watching the screen, watching the numbers, watching the moment slip away like sand through an hourglass. The patient had maybe 3 minutes before irreversible cardiac arrest. 3 minutes before he became another body on another table, another sacrifice that no one would really mourn because he was just a SEAL, just military, just expendable in the eyes of a surgeon who had already decided he was not worth the inconvenience of being woken up at 0200 hours. She looked at the combat medic from the 75th Ranger Regiment standing in the corner. She looked at the pericardiocentesis kit on the sterile field. She looked at the patient's collapsing blood pressure one more time. Then she made a choice that would cost her everything she had built in this hospital. She pulled the procedure cart toward the bedside, her movements decisive and precise. She prepped the pericardiocentesis kit with the kind of speed that came from having done it before, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, a 60-milliliter syringe, sterile gloves that snapped against her wrists like gunshots. She paged the combat medic. I need a witness, she said, her voice steady as ice water. I'm about to save his life without authorization. The medic did not hesitate. He stepped forward and positioned himself where he could see everything, the needle, the patient, the moment when she became either a hero or a criminal, depending on whose version of the story got told first. She did not flinch. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for someone in a white coat to give her permission to practice medicine that was not hers to practice. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had trained for this exact moment in conditions 1,000 times worse than a climate-controlled Houston hospital. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, just left of the xiphoid process, angled toward the left shoulder. She felt the resistance, felt the moment when the needle broke through the pericardial membrane, felt the give as the tip entered the fluid-filled space. The syringe began to fill with blood, dark, urgent blood that had no business being inside the pericardium, blood that was suffocating the heart that was trying to pump it. 40 milliliters. 60 milliliters. 85 milliliters. 120 milliliters total as the pressure inside the pericardium finally released like a valve opening. The heart monitor began to stabilize. The blood pressure began to climb. 68/45. 75/52. 82/58. Sinus rhythm returned. The commander's eyes fluttered open. What happened next did not just end a moment. It ended a life she had been living. It began a countdown to the reckoning that neither she nor Dr. Caldwell understood was already in motion. The ultrasound transducer glided across the commander's chest like a divining rod searching for water, but what Megan was looking for was far deadlier, the dark fluid pooling around his heart, compressing it like a fist slowly closing. The needle lay on the sterile field, 14 gauge, waiting. Around her, the trauma bay had gone quiet except for the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze and the heart monitor's increasingly irregular beeping, a sound like a metronome losing time. The combat medic from the 75th Ranger Regiment stood motionless in the corner, his eyes locked on Megan's hands. BP is 68/40, the resident called out, his voice thin with panic. Dropping. Megan did not respond. Her focus had compressed to a single point, the fluid collection on the ultrasound screen, the pericardial sac distended like a water balloon stretched past its limit. The commander's heart was being suffocated by blood it couldn't pump. For minutes. Maybe 5. The attending surgeon still hadn't answered his phone. The on-call cardiologist was in surgery across town. There was no one else. There was only her and 120 cubic centimeters of blood between a Navy SEAL and the darkness. Her hands moved with the calm of someone who had performed this procedure in forward operating bases under fire, in mud-floored aid stations lit by chemical glow sticks, in the back of a Humvee that was taking incoming rounds. The needle was her conversation with the anatomy she knew like muscle memory knew how to breathe. She marked the insertion point, 5th intercostal space, just lateral to the midclavicular line, the anatomical window that leads straight to the pericardial sac. The skin was pale, almost waxy, the ribs prominent beneath the sterile field like a xylophone waiting to be played. Prep before tubing, she said quietly. Her voice did not waver. It never wavered. The resident scrambled to prepare the drainage catheter with hands that trembled slightly, young hands, inexperienced hands, hands that had read this procedure in textbooks but never performed it under pressure. Megan's hands were steady as a surgical laser. She angled the needle at 35 degrees and felt the membrane of the pericardium give way with that distinctive resistance, that tiny separation that told her she had crossed the threshold from tissue into the sac itself. It was the same feeling she had learned a decade ago in a combat trauma course taught by Navy surgeons at Coronary Naval Special Warfare Center, instructors who trained only Tier 1 specialists who operated where medicine and warfare merged in blood and adrenaline. The ultrasound showed the needle tip advancing toward the fluid pocket. 2 centimeters. 1 centimeter. The tip kissed the fluid and her eyes registered the color, bright red, arterial, fresh. Still bleeding. Still dying. She connected the tubing and the syringe, and as she gently pulled the plunger, the darkness flowed backward into the chamber like a tide reversing. 10 milliliters. 20. The fluid came smoothly, pulling away from the pericardium with each withdrawal, space opening up around the commander's heart like a clenched fist releasing. She worked without speaking, without hesitation, her concentration so absolute that the chaos of the trauma bay seemed to happen in a different room. More fluid. 40 milliliters. 60. The heart monitor's rhythm steadied almost imperceptibly, the beeping finding its cadence again like a metronome being wound tight. BP climbing, the resident said, surprise lifting his voice. Now 88. Megan continued. 80 milliliters. 100. The syringe filled again and again, the reservoir around the commander's heart draining as his vital signs climbed, oxygen saturation 89, then 92, then 95. His body was beginning to breathe, beginning to live again, the compression releasing degree by degree as she extracted the lethal fluid. At 120 milliliters, the ultrasound showed the fluid pocket significantly reduced, the pericardial space opening, the commander's own heart now having room to pump. She withdrew the needle with the same precision she had inserted it, placed a gauze pad over the puncture site, and secured it with tape that made a soft ripping sound as it came off the roll. The room did not move. Nobody breathed. The combat medic was staring at her with an expression she recognized from 1,000 Moments in Helmand, the look of someone who had just watched a specialist do something they had assumed was impossible. "Jesus Christ," the medic whispered. His voice was rough, a voice that had been screaming orders in firefights. That was flawless. Megan did not acknowledge the statement. Acknowledgement would waste time, and time was the one resource she did not have. The commander was stabilized, but stabilized was not safe. Stabilized was the moment when patients died, in that liminal space between crisis and recovery, when the body relaxed its desperate clinging to life and forgot to keep fighting. She needed to keep him fighting. She needed to monitor every beat, every breath, every fluctuation in oxygen and cardiac output, because the window he was in now, the hours between 02:30 and noon, was where the real danger lived. This was where the bleeding resumed. This was where infection set in. This was where sepsis whispered its way into the lungs. This was where young soldiers died quietly, not with drama but with the gradual dimming of a light that had been burning too bright. She pulled a stool to the bedside, metal legs scraping against tile with a harsh sound that made everyone flinch. Everyone but her. "I'm staying with him," she said. It was not a request. "Someone get me a fresh for pole. And get me the advanced cardiac life support medications laid out on the crash cart. I want them visible, within arm's reach, not locked away." The resident and 2 nurses moved as if they were in a trance, suddenly aware that they were not in charge of this room anymore, that something had shifted in the hierarchy of competence. The attending surgeon would eventually show up and claim credit. The hospital administration would eventually find ways to bury what had happened here. But right now, in these hours between the darkness and the dawn, the commander's heartbeat was a rhythm only Megan understood. She sat and began her vigil, her eyes moving between the monitor and the commander's chest, watching the rise and fall, reading the patterns only experience could teach. The fluorescent panel above cast a pale light across his face, highlighting the angle of his jaw, the thin line of his mouth. He was perhaps 40, maybe less, it was hard to tell with operators. Trauma and sun and the compression of a lifetime's stress aged men into something beyond their years. She had held men this age in forward operating bases while their bleeding slowed and their pupils dilated. She had done the mathematics of triage while rounds came in and her people were dying and she had to choose who got her hands and who got prayers. But this one was alive. This one was fighting. At 0400 hours, while Megan was checking the commander's catheter placement and adjusting his flow rate, Dr. Caldwell was receiving an automated alert in his home office. An unauthorized medical procedure. A cardiac emergency. A nurse with suspicious credentials performing interventions beyond her scope. His hands moved across his keyboard with the precision of a man who understood leverage and networks and the machinery of destruction. First call 0405 hours. To Gerald Pierce, chairman of Seattle General's Board of Trustees. A man who owned 3 country clubs and had made $40 million in real estate by knowing which palms to grease and which documents to shred. "Gerald, we have a compliance issue. A staff nurse appears to have fabricated her credentials. Performing procedures outside her license. I'm obligated to report it, but I wanted to give you a heads up first." Second call 0419 hours. To Dr. Helen Voss, Vice President of Medical Affairs. "Helen, we need to move on this immediately. I have documentation. Anonymous reports from colleagues. There's exposure here if we don't act." Third call 0523 hours. To an investigator with the Texas Medical Board. A voice that was not Caldwell's, a voice that came from a burner phone, a voice that planted the seeds. There's a nurse at Seattle General. Megan O'Brien. Check her credentials. I believe they're falsified. She's been treating patients without proper authorization. Someone should look into it. And while Caldwell was making these calls from the climate-controlled sanctity of his home office, Megan sat motionless at the commander's bedside, her uniform rumpled from 7 hours of unbroken focus, her eyes tracking his vital signs with the same intensity she had used to scan the Helmand Province horizon for threats she could not see. At 0500, she adjusted his flow rate. At 0620, she repositioned him slightly to prevent pressure ulcers, her hands moving with such gentleness that he did not wake. At 0745, she suctioned his airway with the kind of care that suggested the tube was made of something precious, not plastic and necessity. The clock moved in increments, each minute a battle fought silently, each hour a victory that brought him closer to safety. The thing about a 10-hour vigil is that it strips away everything except what matters. It removes the performance, the pretense, the careful construction of a persona. Megan had learned long ago how to be invisible, how to make herself small enough that the world passed over her like wind over stone. But vigilance cannot hide. Vigilance is a presence. Vigilance says, I am here, and I am watching, and I will not leave. It was the same presence she had carried through 3 tours in Helmand, the presence of someone who had already accepted the cost of what they were doing. At 0715, Dr. Caldwell arrived at Seattle General and walked past the trauma bay. Through the window, he could see her sitting at the bedside of that SEAL, and his expression hardened into something murderous. A man, he understood, could be destroyed by the appearance of being smaller than he was. And here was this woman, this unremarkable RN in wrinkled scrubs, making him smaller with each passing hour. Making him look like he had failed. Making it clear that when it mattered, when the stakes were highest, she was the only one who had answered. He made one more call at 0731, this one to the University of Washington School of Nursing, to the department head, to the registrar's office. He had a contact there, Dr. Morrison, a man with whom he had shared confidential information about a few of their mutual colleagues. Susan, I'm calling in that favor. I need you to look at nursing school transcripts for a Megan O'Brien. I have concerns about the authenticity of her credentials. Can you verify her graduation and her certifications for me? And the machinery began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing velocity, the way institutional systems move when they have been designed specifically to protect people like Dr. Caldwell and destroy people like Megan. But Megan did not know this yet. She only knew that the commander's heart was still beating, that his oxygen saturation had been stable for 5 hours, that the critical window was narrowing with each sunrise ward creep of the clock. She sat, and she watched, and her hands, the hands that had held lives together in the mud and blood of forward operating bases, remained steady as stone. By 1,000 hours, the commander's vitals had normalized completely. BP 118/76. Heart rate 68. Oxygen saturation 98%. The acute crisis had passed, the window closing, the danger receding into the rearview mirror of time. And still she sat, still her eyes moved between the monitor and the man, because she understood that recovery was not a moment. Recovery was a vigil. Recovery was showing up hour after hour, breath after breath, reading the patterns that others could not see, and staying long enough to prove that you believed he would live. At 1,200 hours, the commander's vitals stabilized into safe ranges. His cardiac output normalized. His oxygen saturation climbed to 94% and held steady. Megan stood beside the bed, reading the patterns in the numbers the way other people read words on a page: rhythm, pressure, perfusion, the language that separates life from death. 10 hours of standing. 10 hours of watching. 10 hours of believing that a man who had bled out could bleed back in. She completed her final documentation with the same meticulous handwriting that had first made her a liability in Dr. Caldwell's eyes. Every fluid ounce recorded. Every vital sign time-stamped. Every intervention documented with surgical precision, because the record was the only thing that mattered when lawyers arrived. Her pen moved across the chart without trembling. Her hand was steady despite the tremor that lived underneath her ribs, the weight of 10 hours that she would carry in the marrow of her bones for the rest of her life. The combat medic approached as she stood, his uniform still carrying the smell of aviation fuel and someone else's blood. He was a young man, maybe 26, with the kind of eyes that had seen things most people could not survive seeing. "I don't know who you really are," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "But that man is alive because of you." Megan simply nodded. She did not speak. She did not need to. Some conversations end before they begin. She walked to the nurse's station to file her report. Her legs moved like someone operating a body remotely, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had burned out. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical hymn, indifferent to what had happened beneath them. The clock on the wall read 12:03. 3 minutes had passed since she had last checked his vitals. Everything was holding. Everything was stable. Everything was going to be. Dr. Caldwell was waiting. He stood at the counter with 2 security guards positioned like bookends, and the hospital's chief nursing officer beside him, her face already wearing the expression of someone about to deliver a verdict that had been decided in advance. The room did not go silent, it had already been silent, but now the silence deepened, became aware of itself, became a living presence that everyone could feel. "Megan O'Brien," Caldwell said, his voice carrying across the entire trauma floor like a knife throw. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately for performing unauthorized medical procedures, falsifying credentials, and gross violation of scope of practice." Nurses and physicians turned to watch. No one moved. No one spoke. The ventilators wheezed their rhythm, indifferent. "Security will escort you from the building. Your badge and access are revoked. You are banned from hospital property pending investigation by the State Medical Board." His words came in measured cadences, each one a small execution. Megan's face showed absolutely nothing. Her jaw might have tightened a fraction, invisible unless you were looking for it. She was not looking for his approval. She was not looking for anything anymore. She removed her badge with steady hands. The metal was warm from her pocket. She placed it on the counter between them, and it lay there like an artifact, proof of a life that no longer belonged to her. She turned to the security guards. "I understand," she said. Her voice was level as a surgical table, as calm as the air in an OR before the first incision. She did not look at Caldwell. She did not defend herself. She did not say that she had saved a man's life when everyone else in the hospital had refused to touch him. She did not say that his on-call surgeon had hung up the phone rather than come downstairs. She did not say any of these things because some truths do not need defending, they exist regardless of whether anyone believes them. She walked between the guards toward the exit. 30 staff members watched her go. The trauma bay doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and for a moment the hallway outside seemed to stretch like it was breathing. Only when she passed the supply closet, the same supply closet where Caldwell had threatened her weeks ago, where she had stood perfectly still and felt absolutely nothing, did her right hand briefly clench into a fist. It lasted perhaps half a second. Unseen by anyone but the shadows. The security guard driving her to her car in the parking garage did not speak. The rain had started again. It fell in sheets that hammered the windshield like applause for a performance no one had asked to witness. She sat in the back seat with her personal items in a cardboard box, a spare stethoscope, photos, the small things that accumulate when you work somewhere long enough to believe you might stay. The rain grew louder. It sounded like a helicopter rotor in the distance. By midnight, she sat alone in a fluorescent-lit diner on Route 90, a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. The coffee had been hot when she ordered it at 10:13 p.m. Now it was a dark mirror, still, reflecting nothing but the ceiling lights. She stared at her hollow reflection in the dark window beside her booth. The restaurant was nearly empty, an old man with a newspaper at the counter, a young couple in a back booth trying not to look at each other. The waitress had stopped asking if everything was okay. Her worn combat boots sat on the seat beside her, the leather creased with a decade of use, the laces still carrying the grit of Helmand Province soil that never quite washes clean. She had smuggled them back in her ruck, stuffed between uniforms and photographs, because some things you do not leave behind even when you are supposed to. They smelled like diesel and dust and something else, something like the memory of being someone before she became no one. The waitress offered a refill. Megan did not respond. She did not blink. She did not acknowledge that another human being had spoken. Outside, an 18-wheeler roared past on Route 90, its engine loud enough to rattle the diner's windows, and for a moment her reflection disappeared entirely into the darkness. Then it came back. She was still there. She was always there. At 2:47 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Just coordinates and a timestamp. She looked at the message for exactly 4 seconds, then put the phone back in her pocket. Some signals do not require acknowledgement. Some messages arrive from people who have been waiting for you to fall far enough to be found. The coffee was cold now. Completely cold. She pushed the cup away and pulled the boots closer, running her hand across the worn leather like she was reading Braille. Somewhere in Houston, Dr. Caldwell was sleeping soundly in his 6-bedroom colonial, his network still intact, his position still secure, his crimes still undocumented in any official capacity. Somewhere in the hospital, the commander was sleeping too, his vitals stable, his life measured in monitors and medications that Megan O'Brien, or whatever name they had decided was her real one, had delivered back to him before they had taken everything else. The rain kept falling. The fluorescent lights kept humming. The diner kept serving cold coffee to people with nowhere else to go. And in the darkness of Route 90, waiting just beyond the reach of the streetlights, was a 2-star admiral with a file folder marked classified and exactly enough authority to call people back from the dead. 2 days after the folding chair in the diner, a Taliban commander-turned-cooperative witness arrived at Seattle General in an armored SUV surrounded by federal protection officers. His name had been redacted from every file. His face was weathered like ancient stone, ice that had seen things that left permanent marks. The surgical team was prepping him for emergency hernia repair when he shuffled past Megan in the second-floor hallway, flanked by 2 men in dark sunglasses who never blinked. He stopped. His entire body went rigid. When he whispered, it came out in Pashto, a language that hadn't been spoken in this hospital before, hadn't been expected. Maliki Helmand. Angel of Helmand Province. His voice cracked like old leather. Then his knees buckled and he collapsed forward, the federal protection officers catching him before he hit the floor, shouting for medical assistance, for oxygen, for the stretcher that was already screaming around the corner. The security guard who caught him, a man named Clayton, veteran of Kandahar, 23 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, stood frozen in the chaos, staring at Megan with the expression of someone watching a photograph suddenly come to life in front of them. As the medical team rushed the commander toward surgery, Clayton stepped directly in front of her, his weathered face gone pale. He said, his voice barely steady. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien. She performed 47 combat surgeries under fire in Helmand Province." 47. He repeated it like a prayer. "I served in Kandahar. You don't forget names like that. You don't forget what that patch means." He pointed at the insignia she wasn't supposed to be wearing anymore, the one the hospital had tried to erase when they took her badge. The hallway had gone completely silent. Rubber gloves stopped snapping. Ventilators kept their mechanical rhythm, but nothing else moved. And that was when the admiral walked through the automatic doors. A 2-star admiral, his dress blues sharp enough to cut glass, he's bearing the kind that made colonels straighten their spines involuntarily. He carried a file folder marked classified in letters so red they looked like blood. Behind him came 2 officers in identical dress uniforms, and behind them came hospital administration, the chief nursing officer who had processed Megan's termination, the board members who had rubber-stamped her firing without question. The admiral moved through the crowd like a man accustomed to parting seas. He walked directly to the hospital's boardroom, where an emergency meeting was somehow already being called, phones ringing, administrators scrambling, the machinery of institutional panic suddenly grinding into motion. Megan wasn't invited. She wasn't asked. She simply found herself standing in that room, and nobody had the authority to remove her. The Admiral opened the classified file on the polished mahogany table. His voice was low and steady, the kind of calm that comes from having already made the hard decisions. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan Erin O'Brien. Enlisted United States Navy. 12 years active duty. 3 tours in Helmand Province, 2 in Iraq. Completed Naval Special Warfare Surgical Training at Coronero Naval Special Warfare Center. He paused. The room's air pressure changed. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Each one landed like a verdict. Purple Heart. Another pause. Longer this time. Purple Heart. And Navy Cross recipient for operations in Sanjan Valley, March 2019. The chief nursing officer's face had gone the color of old newspaper. Master Chief O'Brien, the Admiral continued, was placed at Seattle General Hospital 6 months ago as part of a federal investigation into healthcare fraud operated by this institution. Her documentation, meticulous, comprehensive, and entirely accurate, forms the evidentiary basis for federal indictment of Dr. Richard Caldwell on 47 counts spanning healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and wire fraud totaling approximately $8 million in fraudulent billing. He closed the file with a sound like a hammer striking anvil. When this institution terminated her employment based on fabricated allegations, you violated federal whistleblower protections. You also, unknowingly, fired the single most qualified trauma surgeon in this hospital, Navy-trained, combat-experienced, and currently embedded in an active federal investigation that is about to become very public and very expensive for everyone in this room who knew better. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. 2 hours later, the commander regained consciousness in the surgical recovery unit. Megan was there, not assigned, not official, just present, checking his monitors with the precision of someone who had done this before in places where there were no monitors at all. His eyes opened slowly, swimming back from anesthesia, and the first thing they focused on was her face. "You," he said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "You stayed." 10 hours, she said simply. "Didn't leave." "Same thing," he said, and his eyes closed again, but his hand reached out until it found hers. "Marja. 14-hour firefight. Pressure on the femoral, you wouldn't let go. Wouldn't leave. 17 of us made it out because you held pressure and you held on and you held us together." His grip tightened. "You were the last thing we saw before we lived. You were the angel." Megan's jaw tightened, not breaking, never breaking, just that small muscle movement of someone containing something vast and difficult. "I'm here now," she said. And then the doors burst open. 2 FBI agents in dark suits stepped forward from their positions near the entrance, where they had been standing since the Admiral's arrival, waiting, watching, documenting. The lead agent was younger, with the kind of cold efficiency that comes from having made arrests in places far more dangerous than Houston. "Dr. Richard Caldwell, you are under arrest for 47 counts of healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud Medicare." The handcuffs came out like a verdict. A CNN camera crew, somehow already present, already filming, already positioned, captured every moment in crystalline detail. Caldwell was being walked past the nurse's station where he had humiliated Megan 3 days earlier, his hands cuffed, his face gray, his mouth moving soundlessly as the agent read him his rights. The documentation provided by Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien during her 6-month embedded investigation has provided sufficient evidence for indictment on all counts, the agent said, his voice flat and professional. Dr. Martinez and Dr. Chen pressed themselves against the wall like they could disappear into the paint. The chief nursing officer stared at her shoes with the intensity of someone hoping the floor would open. As Caldwell passed Megan in the hallway, he hissed, a sound like steam escaping a broken valve, "You destroyed my career." She met his eyes with the flat calm of someone who had stared down worse men in worse places, men with guns instead of credentials, men in caves instead of corner offices. "No, doctor," she said, her voice dropping half an octave, the military in her finally audible. "You destroyed your career. I just documented it." The cameras captured his federal vehicle pulling away. The hospital staff watched through windows like spectators at an execution. One by one, they turned back to their work, but everything had changed. The power structure had inverted. The invisible had become visible. The Angel of Helmand had a name now, and her rank, and her boots. 6 months later, a hospital volunteer reported seeing Dr. Richard Caldwell sitting at a folding table outside a Houston strip mall in an industrial district near the interstate. He was wearing a cheap polo shirt and selling supplemental insurance policies to disinterested passers-by. People who glanced at him moved on, never recognizing the man whose photograph had been in the Wall Street Journal and the Houston Chronicle and medical ethics seminars across the country. His medical license had been revoked in all 50 states. His bank account seized. His wife had filed for divorce. The empire of phantom procedures and fraudulent billing had collapsed entirely, leaving nothing behind but a folding table and the slow humiliation of obsolescence. The same combat medic who first noticed Megan's surgical technique tracked down the volunteer to confirm the sighting. Then he sent Megan a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, showing a gray-haired man in a polo shirt sitting alone beneath fluorescent lights. A single word accompanied it: justice. Megan printed it and taped it next to her SEAL team photograph in her office, which was no longer a storage closet but a proper office with a window and her name on the door and her rank in letters so clear they looked like prophecy finally arriving. On a Tuesday evening, 3 months later, she stood in the trauma bay of Seattle General wearing her Navy uniform for the first time in the hospital's halls, her Master Chief insignia catching the fluorescent lights like polished brass. Her worn combat boots were locked in her office upstairs, positioned beside that photograph of 17 faces in Helmand Province, young men who had looked at the camera with the exhausted satisfaction of soldiers who survived because someone stayed when everyone else left. The hospital had invited her back for a presentation on operational integrity in medical settings. The staff who had ignored her, who had avoided her eyes, who had whispered about the uptight nurse suddenly filled the room with their full attention. She spoke about the intersection of military medicine and civilian healthcare ethics, about the cost of looking away, about the price paid by those who stand alone. After the presentation, a young nurse approached hesitantly, not the kind of confidence that comes from seniority, but the kind that comes from witnessing something that breaks the normal rules of hospital hierarchy. "Master Chief, why did you let him humiliate you?" the nurse asked. "You could have stopped it any time. She gestured at Megan's insignia, her uniform, her bearing. "You're clearly far more qualified than he could ever be. Why didn't you just tell him?" Megan considered the question, her eyes moving to the window where ambulances arrived in the rain-slicked Houston night, their lights painting the glass in rhythms of red and white. "Because some missions require you to save lives twice," she said finally, her voice steady and low. "Once on the battlefield with your hands. Once in the evidence that brings criminals to justice. The humiliation was temporary. The mission was permanent. I couldn't blow my cover to punch him. I needed his crimes documented. I needed him neutralized. And I needed every single person he victimized to have justice in a courtroom, not just revenge in a hallway." She turned back to the young nurse. "That's what real power looks like. Not anger. Not confrontation. Just staying. Just holding steady when everything is falling apart around you." The rain outside hammered the windows like applause. The SEAL commander, now fully recovered and returned to active duty with his unit, had sent her a handwritten letter that sat in her desk drawer. "You stayed 10 hours when no one else would. That's what heroes do. They stay. Thank you for staying." Dr. Martinez passed in the hallway, saw her standing in uniform, saw the bars and insignia and everything they represented, and quickly changed direction. Megan allowed herself the smallest smile, barely a movement of her mouth, just enough to count as permission. "Power is not a title," she said to the young nurse still standing beside her. "Power is the ability to help." Through the trauma bay doors, another ambulance arrived. Megan O'Brien, Master Chief Petty Officer, Navy Cross recipient, and guardian of the wounded, moved toward it with steady hands. The young nurse watched her go, understanding finally that the quietest person in the room had been the one holding it all together the entire time. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please hit subscribe. Share your own stories in the comments below. And if you've ever witnessed quiet heroism in your own workplace, in your own life, let me know. These are the stories that matter most.